William the Conqueror led a life marked by extraordinary triumph and ruthless ambition. Orphaned young and born illegitimately, his early years were plagued by turmoil and violence, as rival Norman nobles vied for control of the boy duke. Despite these challenges, William subdued treacherous kinsmen and secured his rule over Normandy. By the 1050s, William emerged as a serious contender for the English throne, then held by his childless cousin Edward the Confessor. Upon Edward's death in January of the year 1066, Harold Godwinson claimed the crown, but William argued that Edward had previously promised it to him, and that Harold had sworn an oath to uphold his claim. In September of the year 1066, William invaded England, defeating and killing Harold at the legendary Battle of Hastings. On Christmas Day that year, he was crowned as the King of England. William's reign, however, was far from peaceful. Rebellions erupted, most notably in Northumbria, led by Edgar Atheling, the last male blood heir of the House of Wessex. William responded with brutal efficiency, culminating in the infamous harrying of the north. Villages were burnt to the ground, crops and livestock destroyed, and entire populations massacred, leaving up to 100,000 dead, and reports of cannibalism among the starving survivors. The chronicler Orderic Vitalis wrote bitterly, "The king stopped at nothing to hunt his enemies. He cut down many people and destroyed homes and land. I can say nothing good about this brutal slaughter. God will punish him." Even after his grip on England tightened, dissent continued. Some Norman Earls rose against him, criticising his harsh rule and illegitimacy and calling him usurper. Although the rebellion of the Earls was crushed, later his own son Robert Curthose rebelled and sided with William's enemies, and reportedly unhorsed William in battle, staying his hand only after recognising his father's voice through his helmet. Though disinherited at first, on William's deathbed, Robert was later forgiven and was granted Normandy, while William Rufus, the second son, inherited England. As a warrior, William was unmatched in his prime. His leadership made the Normans nearly invincible. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle reflects on his legacy. King William was a man of great wisdom and formidable power, more honoured and mighty than any of his forebears. He was gracious to the good, but unrelentingly harsh to any who dare oppose his will. This is his story. William's ancestor was the first Duke of Normandy, Rollo. He was a Viking raider who would besiege the city of Chartres in the year 911. Although the siege resulted in a defeat for the Vikings, Rollo and a small company of his warriors would escape, and due to this, raids in France would continue. The French opened negotiations with Rollo to end the violence, resulting in a treaty establishing the Duchy of Normandy. Rollo would be baptized and assisted King Charles the Simple in defending his realm, and he even took the baptismal name of Robert. Rollo would also marry Gisela, the daughter of Charles, and his descendants would become Christian and quickly lost their Viking culture and became Normans. William was born in the year 1027. He was the son of Robert, the Duke of Normandy, but William was of illegitimate birth, and when his father died, he was still young, being 7 or 8 years old. He would succeed his father in 1035 and assume the role of the Duke of Normandy, but several of his kinsmen, including Guy of Burgundy, his cousin, believed themselves to have a better claim to the title. William was supported by his great-uncle, the Archbishop Robert, as well as King Henry I of France, but in the year 1037, the archbishop would die, and Normandy would quickly descend into chaos. Powerful lords would think having the young William in their custody would allow them power over Normandy. Many Norman nobles would engage in their own private wars during the time of William's childhood, which would lead to many tales of William being hidden in the houses of peasants many a time. So, William the Bastard's reign did not start well. He would experience several years of internal strife. The chronicler William of Jumièges reported that the Duke's guardian, his teacher, and his steward were all killed by rebels, and many members of William's extended family attempted to unseat him. In the year 1046, William's enemies decided to finally strike. They would attempt to ambush him and kill him, but the plot failed. The rebel nobles led by Guy of Burgundy would raise an army, estimated to have been over 20,000 strong, knowing the response would be severe. After escaping the ambush, William rode directly to King Henry's court, wanting to protect his vassal and ally. King Henry himself raised an army of around 10,000 men and then marched on Normandy. The result would be the Battle of Val-ès-Dunes. In the summer of the year 1047, King Henry's army joined Duke William's much smaller Norman force in the heart of rebel territory. During the first part of the battle, Ralph Tesson, a Norman baron, decided to betray the rebels and joined William and the king's army. The battle consisted mainly of a series of cavalry skirmishes. The rebel army outnumbered the royal army, but it lacked leadership. William would prove his military prowess here and would fight in the front lines alongside the king. After losing several skirmishes and many men, the rebel army broke apart and then found themselves running for their lives. The royal army pursued closely, slaughtering rebels by the thousands and driving the remnants of their army into the Orne River. A spectator recorded that the bodies of the rebel knights who tried to cross the river were so numerous that bloated bodies blocked a mill as the river carried the bodies downstream. While the royal army drove much of the rebel army to the west, Guy of Burgundy and his surviving forces escaped to his lands in the east and held up in the castle of Brionne. Despite a long siege, William was not able to force the castle into surrender until the year 1050, and during that time he was not able to assert his authority in the whole of his realm. The French king had supported William at the Battle of Val-ès-Dunes, but in the year 1052 he decided to go against William, perhaps fearing his growing influence over Normandy, and led an alliance of French barons against him. Two forces would invade Normandy, one coming from northeastern France, and the second entered eastern Normandy and began widespread devastation. While Duke William faced off against the French king, an allied force of Norman barons and other lords came out of their own lands. The French force was widely scattered and was an easy target for the Norman forces. The fierce engagement lasted many hours, but the French left with heavy losses. Guy, the Count of Ponthieu, was captured during the course of the battle. The French king saw all of this from his vantage point on a hill just across the river, and he withdrew the remainder of his forces. After the defeats of 1052, the rebellious Norman lords were exiled, the Norman lands of the Counts of Ponthieu were confiscated, and Guy swore oaths to William after 2 years' imprisonment. William would, however, soon face even more strife. In 1057, the army of King Henry and Geoffrey Martel would ride for Normandy, with their aim being invasion and conquest. Their forces quickly began raiding and pillaging. Duke William, who appears to have been reluctant to oppose his overlord directly, gathered a large army, but took no other action besides keeping scouts out to report the invading forces' movements. When the invaders reached a ford on the river Dives near Watteville, They began to cross, but when the tide came in, the process had only been half completed, leaving the army split in two. William seized this opportunity and attacked half of the invading army that had not yet crossed. William would surprise his enemies and turned the river red with blood, resulting in a massacre. The invaders retreated quickly from Normandy, and the battle also marked the end of the last invasion of Normandy during Duke William's lifetime. After the retreat of Henry and Geoffrey, William was finally able to extend his influence outside of his Norman lands. In the year 1058, William invaded King Henry's lands and recaptured the castle at Thiers, which had been lost to the Normans during William's minority, again proving William's military might. He had overcome a king who had once been an ally, and had suffered much trauma in his childhood due to the murder of all of his parental guardians. This fire, however, had made William emerge stronger and harder. Kings feared him, and he was now one of the most powerful lords in France. Prior to the reign of Edward the Confessor in the 11th century, the English throne had been under Viking influence after the conquest of England by Sweyn Forkbeard and his son Canute the Great. Once the throne came back into the possession of the Saxon line, its power was much diminished. Edward the Confessor would be remembered as a politically weak king. His death brought about one of the most famous fights for the throne in history. Once Edward assumed the throne, he and Godwin the Earl of Wessex would become open rivals. Godwin was the richest and most powerful man in England, with his influence spanning beyond that of the king. However, King Edward would fill his court with Normans, as he had grown up in Normandy, where he went into exile during the first rule of the Viking kings of England. The Saxon Earls would grow bitter at King Edward, surrounding himself with Normans at the English court, and as this happened, Edward found his power diminishing. The leaders of the ancient kingdoms of England, Wessex, Mercia and Northumbria, were drifting away from their king, with Earl Godwin of Wessex having the most influence among them. As Edward had no heir, Godwin would groom his son Harold to become the next King of England, and upon Godwin's death, his son Harold Godwinson would assume the earldom of Wessex. In the year 1064, Harold would endure a disastrous visit to Normandy. For some unknown reason, he had taken a ship and had been wrecked on the territory of Guy of Ponthieu, a vassal of William the Duke of Normandy. William made Guy hand over his captive, and then, as a condition of release, he required that Harold should take an oath of allegiance to him, with death or permanent captivity in a dungeon as the probable alternatives. Harold took the oath. In William's eyes, his ascension to the English throne would now be smoother. In the year 1065, Edward the Confessor became very ill, and he would die on the 5th of January in the year 1066. Several people claimed they should be the next King of England. The claims of the throne of these men were based on blood ties, oaths, kinship, and links to earlier kings. Each claim to the throne was strong. There was Edgar the Atheling, who was the grandson of King Edmund Ironside and the son of Edward the Exile. Edward the Exile had died on his way to the English court, where he would have been named heir by King Edward the Confessor. According to the lineage system, he was the rightful heir, being a direct descendant of Alfred the Great. However, by 1066, Edward had a weakened power base, and in recent years, many Ethelings had been assassinated or had mysteriously died, just like Edgar's father, Edward the Exile, and his grandfather, Edmund Ironside, who died under mysterious circumstances. There was also Harold Godwinson, who was the head of the House of Wessex. Wessex was the richest and most powerful part of England, and Harold himself was well known in court. He had acted for Edward the Confessor and had fought in many battles. He was also the most trusted military commander in all England. In addition, according to legend, it is also thought that his ancestor was Ethelred, the King of Wessex, and older brother to Alfred the Great, with the crown only passing his direct line due to Ethelred's son at the time being too young to rule, due to the threat of the great heathen army. In Norway, Harald Hardrada also laid claim to the throne of England. According to him, Edward the Confessor had usurped his nephew King Magnus the Good. Magnus had been named as heir to the Danish throne by King Harthacnut. After the agreement, Magnus believed that this accord extended to the English throne as well. Edward simply took the throne before Magnus, who would die childless. Magnus's co-king of Norway was Harald Hardrada, until the death of Magnus, in which Hardrada became the sole king of Norway. Hardrada now believed the crown of England was rightfully his, as Edward had usurped Magnus, and he himself was now dead. William, the Duke of Normandy, was another claimant to the throne. He claimed that not only had Edward designated him to be the next king, but that Harold Godwinson had sworn under oath that he would support William in his claim to the throne. There was also the relationship that existed between Normandy and England. Emma of Normandy was the great aunt of William, and Edward the Confessor had spent much of his early life in exile in the Norman court. The day after Edward the Confessor's death, there was a meeting of the Witan to decide who would become the next King of England. The Witan was made up of a group of many lords and bishops, and they considered the merits of the main four candidates: William, the Duke of Normandy, Harold Godwinson, Edgar Atheling, the last direct descendant of Alfred the Great, and Harald Hardrada. The whole principle of succession had been turned upside down by the interlude of Viking kings, and the Witan no longer felt itself bound to choose a king belonging to the line of Alfred, when it was obvious that a strong man was needed on the throne, and Edgar the Atheling was a mere boy. Whatever promises Edward the Confessor may have made to William, he undoubtedly himself nominated Harold as his successor. The day after Edward's death, Harold was elected by the Witan as king. Hardrada would come for his crown, but was defeated by Godwinson at the Battle of Stamford Bridge. Thus, the new King of England proved himself to be a brilliant strategist and commander, and would cement his name in history. As the English king Harold Godwinson was fighting in the north, William was sailing across the Channel, with his aim being conquest and the forging of a new dynasty. William, the Duke of Normandy, would obtain consent from Pope Alexander II for the English invasion, and he would also carry the papal banner, signifying that God was with him. William also secured the political support of Henry IV, the Holy Roman Emperor, and King Sweyn II of Denmark. William and his fleet crossed the Channel, unhindered during the night of the 28th of September in 1066. After defeating Hardrada at Stamford Bridge on the 25th of September, Harold Godwinson had to march south with all speed in order to confront the Norman invaders. In the morning of the 14th of October 1066, William, the Duke of Normandy, divided his army into three groups: archers, foot soldiers, and cavalry. Harold Godwinson's troops would approach under the cover of the woodland, and they took up their positions on the top of a hill. This high position allowed them to harass any soldiers attempting to climb up by throwing javelins at them. The English would soon form a shield wall, with the front ranks holding their shields close together or even overlapping to provide protection from ranged attacks. The battle began with the Norman archers shooting uphill, but the English shield wall easily repelled the arrows. Next, the Norman spearmen would engage the English in melee combat. Upon approaching the English, the Norman soldiers were met with a barrage of javelins until hand-to-hand combat ensued. William's soldiers were being decimated and they couldn't break through the shield wall, so the Norman cavalry would advance to support them. The cavalry was also unable to break through the Saxon shield wall. Although exhausted, the English army was in high spirits, having just defeated Harold Hardrada in the north, and they would drive the Normans back as blood ran down the hill of the battlefield. As the Normans failed to break the Anglo-Saxon shield wall, the battle began to turn in the English's favour, and a general retreat began. A rumour then spread that Duke William himself had been slain in the fighting. Some of the Norman troops retreated towards the sea, pursued by the English, who at last left their positions at the top of the slope. As he watched his own army's flight, William, very much alive, removed his helmet so everyone could recognise him, and rode through his retreating forces, shouting and gesturing. After being so close to defeat, the Norman horsemen returned to the front lines and helped William in leading a counterattack against the pursuing English forces. The English would reform their shield wall, and battle ensued. The battle would rage on for hours, and with the autumn daylight fading, the Normans made one final effort to take the ridge. At this point, many Saxon lords had been killed, with two of King Harold Godwinson's own brothers having fallen in the fighting. This would encourage the King of England to fight to the bitter end. Godwinson himself would be in the thick of the fighting, slaying many enemy soldiers, but he would be killed in the chaos of the battle. According to one account, he was hacked to death at the hands of 4 Norman knights, in graphic detail. The first, cleaving his breast through his shield with his point, drenched the earth with a gushing torrent of blood. The second smote off his head below the protection of the helmet, and the third pierced the inward of his belly with a lance. The fourth hewed off his thigh and bore away the severed limb. William of Malmesbury stated that Harold died from an arrow to the eye that pierced his brain, and that a knight wounded him at the same time. With many different accounts of Harold's bloody death, historians agree that he died at the end of the battle, and met his end in the midst of the fighting. Harold Godwinson's death left the English leaderless, and their formation began to collapse. However, the soldiers of Harold's household guard gathered around the king's body and fought to the bitter end. After an entire day of fierce battle, William of Normandy's men were victorious. After the Battle of Hastings, William expected the English nobles to simply submit to him, but one of the old claimants to the throne would be proclaimed the king by the Witan. Edgar the Atheling, the grandson of Edmund Ironside and the last direct descendant of Alfred the Great, would assume the throne. He was supported by powerful surviving members of the Saxon ruling class, such as Edwin, the Earl of Mercia, and Morcar, the Earl of Northumbria. However, these lords had already passed over his claim in favour of Harold Godwinson, and their loyalties were questionable. William would soon cross the River Thames, and as the Normans closed in on London, Edgar's key supporters began negotiations with William. In December, the remaining members of the Witan in London would gather and took the uncrowned king to meet William and submit to him. Edgar, with no army, no loyal English earls, and no allies, would do homage to William, setting aside his ancestral claim as the King of England, for a time. On the 25th of December 1066, William was crowned the King of England in Westminster Abbey. His achievement earned him the title, the Conqueror. Despite the submission of the English nobles, resistance continued for years, with there being many rebellions and uprisings in Northumbria. William kept Edgar in his custody and took him along with other English leaders to his court in Normandy in 1067, before returning with them to England. Edgar would soon escape his custody under William. This 16-year-old boy would ride north and would stir rebellion. In the shadows, the northern rebels were organising themselves into an effective force around the figurehead Edgar Atheling. Edgar would make an alliance with Malcolm III, the King of the Scots, who married Edgar's sister Margaret. Not only did the rebels want to reinstate what they considered to be the true line of kings of England, as they were already calling and referring to Edgar as the king, but the Anglo-Saxon lords had also lost much of their lands to the Norman nobles, and Edgar was their solution in getting back their lost power. Edgar had also forged an alliance with another king, Sweyn II of Denmark, who promised to back him and send him men should he need his assistance against William. Northumbria had long been a wild and dangerous place. However, when William the Conqueror ascended to the English throne, it truly became a savage land, not discriminating between high and low-born. Cosby, a Northumbrian magnate, offered homage to William, and William rewarded this by making him the Earl of Northumbria. After just 5 weeks as Earl, Cosby was murdered by Ossulf, the grandson of Uhtred the Bold, in a blood feud that had lasted generations. Soon enough, Ossulf would also be slain, and his cousin Cospatrick would buy the earldom from William. Earl Cospatrick would soon become one of the leaders who joined the young Edgar Atheling in his rebellion against William. Edwin the Earl of Mercia would also join the rebellion. Edgar now had the allegiance of the King of Scotland, the King of Denmark, the Earl of Northumbria, and the Earl of Mercia. Edgar had the support of nations and half of England, and he was the true last heir of the land, so the people would rally to him. He was a symbol of hope against the invading Normans, who had subjugated much of the English aristocracy and were demanding high taxes, affecting lord and peasant alike. William, now aware that trouble was brewing in the north, sent Robert the Comyn to Northumbria with 700 men to dispose of Gospatrick from the earldom of Northumbria, as word had reached the king's ears of his treachery. Robert would reach as far north as Durham. When he arrived, Bishop Ethelwine warned him that a rebel army was lingering in the north and would mobilise against him. Robert, however, would ignore this advice. The Northumbrian rebels attacked the city of Durham in 1069. They would quickly storm into the city and began slaying any Normans they came across. Robert's Norman knights were quickly put to the sword or fled, thus completely wiping out his army and William the Conqueror's hold of the north. Robert would hear the commotion from inside the bishop's house he was staying in. The rebels knew the bishop had sided with the Normans and had abandoned his fellow Saxons, so they burnt his house to the ground, and Robert was consumed by the flames. Durham had just fallen, and Edgar Atheling would take advantage of this, with the energy of the Northerners being unmatched due to their restless spirit. He would march south to the city of York. The city quickly fell, as the townsmen recognised Edgar as their natural lord, and would call him king. Edgar, who although was young, was now a leader of men, but the Game of Thrones he was playing was dangerous, and the land he wished to rule would suffer. According to the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, this is what transpired. Edgar Atheling marched with all the Northumbrians to York, and the townsmen treated with him, on which King William came from the south with all of his troops, and sacked the town, and slew many hundred persons. William, just back from Normandy at the time, received news of the disasters at Durham and York, and responded in typical fashion, personally marching north with an even bigger army than previously. William arrived at York so quickly, he caught the rebels off guard, and routed those still with the stomach to fight. After Edgar's early success, William quickly showed him who had the more competent army. Under the Conqueror, the Normans were truly a force to be reckoned with. They had already put down one Anglo-Saxon king, and the Atheling was next. The Danes had long claimed parts of England as their own, and these Viking warriors were infamous for taking full advantage of any political upheaval in foreign parts they considered a rich source of plunder. Asbjorn, the brother of Sweyn II of Denmark, landed off the coast of northern England with a Danish fleet of some 300 ships in September of 1069, and Edgar was recalled from Scotland. York was, yet again, to be the focal point of the rebellion. The Danes reportedly sailed to York with 240 ships, where they met Edgar Atheling and Earl Cospatrick of Northumbria. In the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, they were described as an immense army. Edgar would personally lead his men to York, and they quickly retook the city through bloodshed. In the chaos, the Norman castle there was demolished, the slaughter was recorded, and many Frenchmen fell, and many prisoners were carried back to the Danes' ships. Edgar yet again had defeated the forces of William and had retaken the north. This was the biggest Norman defeat of the entire conquest, and now the most serious threat to William's reign in England. William assembled an army and marched. When the king finally arrived at his destination, he found an empty city. The Danes had retreated down the River Trent with their extensive riches from York, and Edgar and his allies were gone. Without a fleet of his own, William could not pursue the Danes, and so he returned to the old policy of the Anglo-Saxon kings and paid them to leave the English shores. To make it clear to anyone with an interest in the north of England, William decided to spend the Christmas of 1069 in York, even moving the royal court there. William was telling the country the north was his, and he would hold it by any means necessary. The Conqueror then turned his attention to the rebels, as they were not prepared to meet his army in a pitched battle. So, William would employ a strategy that would cripple his enemy, but that would also stain his soul forever. Edgar would retaliate and led a sea-borne raid into the kingdom of Lindsey, which was a lesser Anglo-Saxon kingdom that had been absorbed into Northumbria. Edgar would again prove his mettle and would lead his men into the action himself, in order to further prove he was worthy to be king. However, the raid ended in disaster, with most of Edgar's followers being slain. Edgar himself managed to escape alive with a handful of royal followers, and then rejoined the bulk of his army. Early in the year 1070, William moved against Edgar and the other English leaders, who had taken refuge with their remaining followers in a marshy region, and he put them to flight. Edgar then returned to Scotland. King William was growing weary of the rebellion in the north. It was as if the region had declared its independence, so the Conqueror would move to break the Northerners in body and spirit. Orderic Vitalis was a monk who was born in Shropshire in 1075, of a Saxon mother and a Norman father. He was a chronicler who wrote one of the great contemporary chronicles of the 11th and 12th century, Normandy and Anglo-Norman England. He usually praised King William in his writings, but wrote this about the harrying of the north. The king stopped at nothing to hunt down his enemies. He cut down many people and destroyed homes and land. Nowhere else had he shown such cruelty, and to his shame, he made no effort to control his fury, and he punished the innocent with the guilty. He ordered that crops and herds, tools and food be burned to ashes. More than 100,000 people perished of hunger. I have often praised William in this book, but I can say nothing good about this brutal slaughter. God will punish him. Any lingering rebels across the north of England were mercilessly hunted down and executed or tortured. The north once again became a lawless land, with people forced into eating whatever they could, from dogs to human corpses. Yes, the Northumbrians resorted to cannibalism in order to survive. The north was on fire. Entire villages and fields were burned. Men, women and children put to the sword, or perhaps suffered an even worse fate of withering away until death claimed them. Edgar's allies were slowly losing power. King Sweyn II of Denmark had been bought off by William, and the north was on fire. Edgar would flee back to Scotland with his allies. En route, Earl Edwin of Mercia was murdered, betrayed by his own retinue. Gospatrick, the Earl of Northumbria, couldn't feed or transport an army, as his lands were ash and his people's spirits broken. Edgar remained in the safety of Scotland until 1072. William would then invade Scotland, with its king being the last rebel with major influence. He then forced King Malcolm to submit to his overlordship. The terms of the agreement was the expulsion of Edgar from England, under pain of death. Edgar's rebellion was over. Now out of allies, he sailed for France, but the luckless Edgar was shipwrecked on the coast of England by a violent storm. He managed to escape to Scotland yet again, where he was persuaded by Malcolm to make peace with William and return to England as his subject, abandoning any ambition of regaining his ancestral throne. William forged his new dynasty, and the impact of his conquest of England was profound, leaving enduring changes in the country's church, aristocracy, culture, and language. The conquest brought England into closer contact with France, establishing ties that persisted throughout the Middle Ages. His administration merged aspects of English and Norman governance, creating a new system that laid the foundations for the later medieval English kingdom. His massacre of the people of Northumbria, known as the Harrying of the North, is what allowed him to consolidate his power. In the year 1075, while King William was in Normandy, a rebellion broke out in England. Two powerful nobles, Ralph de Gale, the Earl of East Anglia, and Roger, the Earl of Hereford, conspired to overthrow him in what became known as the Revolt of the Earls. Ralph, who had once fought bravely at the Battle of Hastings, was widely admired for his courage and strength of character. The chronicler Orderic Vitalis recorded some of the grievances that drove the rebels to act. Chief among them was William's ruthless suppression of both real and imagined threats to his rule. In the eyes of the conspirators, William was a tyrant, unworthy of the crown. They denounced him as a usurper, born as a bastard, and claimed his rule was offensive to both God and man. They accused him of poisoning his own guests and kinsmen, as well as orchestrating the death of Conan of Brittany, a nobleman admired throughout the region. They also condemned his harsh treatment of allies and soldiers who had fought for him, saying they were repaid with barren lands or nothing at all. His greed, they claimed, drove him to strip them of even that. In short, William was hated, and they believed his death would bring joy to many. Despite their bold plans, the revolt began to unravel before it could begin. Wulftheof, the Earl of Northumbria, and the last remaining Anglo-Saxon Earl, lost confidence in the plot. Known for his kindness and piety, Wulftheof confessed the conspiracy to William. Though some believe he hoped for mercy, William had him imprisoned and a year later executed. His death shocked the people. Many came to see him as a martyr, and a cult later formed around his memory. It was said that Wulftheof's unjust execution cast a curse upon William for the rest of his life. After Wulftheof's confession, the rebellion had little time to gather strength. Ralph fled to Denmark to seek reinforcements, while his wife Emma stayed behind to defend Norwich Castle. William, still in Normandy, trusted his commanders in England to suppress the uprising. The castle at Norwich was soon besieged and eventually surrendered. Emma and the garrison were allowed to leave and were sent safely to Brittany. Meanwhile, Canute, the brother of the King of Denmark, finally arrived with a fleet of 200 ships, but he was too late. The rebellion had already been crushed. The Danes raided the English coast, but soon returned home, having made no real impact. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle even stated, "But they dare not risk a battle with King William, but chose rather to go to York, where they broke into St. Peter's Minster, and having taken thence much treasure, went away again." William returned to England later that same year to address the lingering Danish threat, leaving his wife Queen Matilda to rule in Normandy during his absence. He spent Christmas in Winchester, where he dealt with the aftermath of the failed rebellion, one that would be remembered not only for its ambition, but for the tragic end of the last great English Earl. Robert, the eldest son of William the Conqueror, was in his youth a man of courage and exceptional skill in military pursuits. He had long held the title of Count and enjoyed an official, if somewhat symbolic, role at his father's court. Twice, the barons had pledged their loyalty to him as the future ruler, and he had been formally acknowledged as his father's heir. Despite these honours, Robert wielded no real power. William, ever a cautious and commanding ruler, had no intention of relinquishing authority during his lifetime. While he might have bestowed titles for the sake of appearances, he remained the sole master of his realms. For a young prince like Robert, kept in ceremonial idleness and surrounded by restless young nobles, this was both frustrating and dangerous. Naturally, Robert desired independence and a domain of his own, an income, a household, and responsibilities fit for a future king. But William refused, fearing it might undermine his rule. Discontent grew, and Robert's ambitious companions fanned the flames. Encouraged by their reckless advice, Robert boldly approached his father and demanded that the rule of Normandy be handed over to him at once. William flatly refused, explaining that Normandy was his by birthright and England by conquest. It would be unthinkable to hand them over prematurely. Though the discussion reached an impasse, open rebellion did not break out immediately, but then came an incident, recounted by the chronicler Orderic Vitalis, that would tip Robert over the edge. One day his younger brothers, William Rufus and Henry, tossed a full chamber pot over his head as a joke. Humiliated and enraged, Robert started a violent quarrel with them, which was only stopped by their father's intervention. When William failed to punish the younger brothers, Robert felt his dignity had been insulted. That very night, Robert gathered his household guard and rode to the Rouen in a rash attempt to seize the castle by surprise. In doing so, he had committed open treason. Furious, William ordered the arrest of the rebels, spreading fear among their ranks and scattering their plans. Some were captured, while others fled across the frontier. The situation worsened when William discovered that his wife, Queen Matilda, Robert's own mother, had been secretly sending their son money. Robert soon gained the support of King Philip of France, and together they raised a formidable army. Now William was forced to respond to the growing threat. The rebels were raiding his northeastern frontier, bringing fear to the countryside. In response, he stationed troops near the border and, determined to stop them, marched to lay siege to the stronghold of Gerbois in the dead of winter, just after Christmas of the year 1078. For 3 weeks, the siege continued, as was the custom of the time. Knights from both sides issued formal challenges, and small-scale battles erupted between hand-picked warriors. Finally, the defenders launched a bold counterattack, drawing the besieging army into open battle. In the fierce fighting that followed, father and son came face to face. The aged conqueror, though the veteran of many battles, was no match for his youthful and skilled son. William was wounded in the arm or hand, and his horse was slain beneath him. One account tells of Tokig, a loyal Englishman who rushed forward with another horse to save the king, only to be struck down by an enemy arrow moments later. Another version of the tale claims that Robert, recognizing his father's voice, dismounted and offered his own horse so the king could escape. The royal forces were defeated, many slain or captured, including Robert's younger brother William Rufus, who was injured. It was a complete rout, and William's army fled the field. The defeat was a bitter humiliation for William's long and glorious reign. Not only had he lost his first battle, he was defeated by his own son in single combat. William of Malmesbury even described it as the only true disaster of the conqueror's career. Enraged not only by the betrayal, but by the personal shame of being wounded and unhorsed by his own son, William is said to have laid a terrible curse upon Robert, vowing to disinherit him forever. Not much is known about William's movements between the years of 1082 and 1084. The historian David Bates suggests that the lack of detail likely means nothing particularly remarkable occurred, and much of it took place on the continent, beyond the notice of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. One thing that did occur is that in the year 1082, William had his half-brother Odo arrested. Ordelic Vitalis claimed that Odo harboured ambitions of becoming the Pope, and had tried to persuade some of William's vassals in aiding him in launching an invasion of southern Italy. Such an act would have undermined the king's authority, and William could not tolerate it. Although Odo remained in prison for the rest of William's reign, his lands were never seized. Details about William's own whereabouts during the years 1084 and 1085 are murky. We know he was in Normandy for Easter in the year 1084, and he may have later returned to England to collect money to fund defence against a possible invasion by Canute IV of Denmark. In the Christmas of the year 1085, King William ordered an unprecedented survey of all the land holdings across his kingdom. This vast undertaking, organised by county, would come to be known as the Domesday Book, a record so thorough and final that it was linked to the Last Judgment. For each county, the survey listed every landholder's estates grouped by name. It detailed who held each parcel of land before the Norman Conquest, its current value, the taxes it owed, and the resources it contained, such as the number of peasants, ploughs, livestock, and other assets. By the 1st of August of the year 1086, the work was largely completed. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle notes that on that day, William received the final results, and all the leading nobles of the realm gathered to swear loyalty to him once more, in what became known as the Oath of Salisbury. Though William's exact reasons for commissioning the Domesday Survey remain uncertain, it likely served multiple purposes: to catalogue feudal obligations, to clarify disputes over land, and perhaps most importantly, to assess and justify increased royal taxation. In the year 1085, word spread with great certainty that King Canute of Denmark, the son of King Sweyn II, was preparing to invade England. He had married the daughter of Robert, the Earl of Flanders, and with his support aimed to conquer the kingdom. At the time, King William was in Normandy. Upon hearing of the looming threat, he hurried back to England, bringing with him a vast army of cavalry and infantry, a force larger than the land had ever seen. So immense was the army that people wondered how the country could possibly feed them all. To support his soldiers, the king ordered them to be housed and fed by the local population, with each landholder responsible for providing according to the size of his estate. This caused great hardship across the country. In preparation for a potential invasion, William also ordered the land near the coast to be laid waste, so that any invaders would find little plunder upon arrival. Eventually, reliable news reached William that King Canute's plans had been thwarted and the invasion would not proceed. In response, William allowed part of his army to return home, while the rest remained stationed in England through the winter, ready to defend the realm. William left England near the close of the year 1086 and returned to the continent. Upon his arrival, he arranged the marriage of his daughter Constance to Duke Alan of Brittany, a strategic alliance meant to strengthen his position against the ever-watchful French kings. Meanwhile, his eldest son Robert, still in league with the French crown, continued to stir unrest. His actions were provocative enough that William felt compelled to lead a military campaign against France in the year 1087. In the late summer of that year, King William suddenly appeared with his forces before the gates of Montes. The town's inhabitants and scattered garrison were caught completely off guard, and they fled in chaos. William and his men surged through the gates in pursuit, looting the city, and set it ablaze. It was a brutal act of vengeance, but from that fiery triumph, the Conqueror returned to Normandy a dying man. Whether through illness or a battle wound, William's final days had begun. On his deathbed, William made a decisive choice. His eldest son Robert would not inherit the crown of England. That honour, he declared, would go to his second son, William Rufus. The dying king, it seems, would have gladly disinherited Robert altogether, yet Robert had long been recognised formally as his heir, sworn to by the barons, and already acknowledged as the Duke of Normandy. In his final hours, William reflected that he held England not by hereditary right, but by divine favour and victory in battle over Harold Godwinson. England, he reasoned, was not Robert's to claim. Normandy, however, had been lawfully promised to him, and that grant could not be withdrawn. Advisers at the king's bedside urged him to forgive his son, fearing that William might pass from this world with hatred still burning in his heart. At last, summoning the strength to master his pride, the king called upon God and his nobles to bear witness as he forgave Robert and reaffirmed his right to Normandy. William died soon after, at around the age of 59. The legacy of his reign was profound. His conquest of England ushered in sweeping changes that reshaped the nation's identity. The church was reorganised, the Anglo-Saxon aristocracy was replaced by Norman lords, and the English language began to absorb a flood of Norman French, profoundly influencing its development. Culturally, politically, and linguistically, England was transformed from an Anglo-Scandinavian kingdom into an Anglo-Norman one. William's reign also realigned England's place in the world. Ties with Scandinavia faded, replaced by deepening bonds with continental Europe, especially with France. His rule laid the foundations of the medieval English monarchy, blending Norman and Anglo-Saxon traditions into a new system of governance. Even in death, William remained a figure of debate. Chroniclers like William of Poitiers praised his wisdom and strength, while the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle offered a far more critical view, condemning his heavy-handed rule. But one fact remains clear. William's conquest was not merely a change of kings, but a transformation of a nation. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle offers this reflection on King William in his final days. If anyone wishes to understand what kind of man King William was, the glory he attained, and the many lands over which he ruled, then let us describe him, we who once looked upon his face and walked in his halls. This King William of whom we now speak was a man of great wisdom and formidable power, more honoured and mighty than any of his forebears. He was gracious to the good, those who loved God and walked in righteousness, but he was unrelentingly harsh toward any who dare oppose his will. I would like to give a huge thank you to all of my members. Your contribution is valuable to the continuation of the channel, and I appreciate you all immensely. A special thank you to John Seitz. I hope you all enjoyed the video. If you did, be sure to like, subscribe and share, and I'll see you all next week for another History Profile.